In Lecture 21, we introduced the idea of the monomyth. That is, the idea that there's a kind of universal template to which myths about heroes conforms, despite the fact that there are individual cultural deflections from culture to culture. As we said then, not all scholars and students agree that there is such a thing. We're using it throughout our unit on heroes as a kind of analytical tool to see how it works, and you can make up your own mind about its viability when we're done. We started out with a really simplified or schematic version of the monomyth, and we've used that in the last 3 lectures to look at Gilgamesh, King Arthur, and then Jason and the Argonauts. This time, we want to take a closer look at 2 hypotheses about the monomyths, those of Otto Rank and the one of Joseph Campbell. Campbell's especially has been a focus of a lot of discussion about the viability of this concept. We'll also talk a little bit about meanings of the monomyth for these 2. For Rank, the meanings are primarily Freudian. For Campbell, they're primarily Jungian, both suggesting that in our own age, we tend to read myths psychologically rather than religiously or metaphysically. We'll use some of the myths mentioned by Rank and Campbell as our illustrations as we're going through this, but we can also supplement them with references back to some of the myths we've already done in this course. First, to start with Otto Rank's. As we've mentioned in earlier lectures, his concept of the family romance, as he calls it, informs his idea of the monomyth. His monomyth is always about the first half of life, about birth, childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, when the individual has to establish himself as an independent person in the external world, has to find a job and find a mate. All of this requires separation from one's parents and mastery of one's instincts, which have to be socialized in this process. The issues are essentially Freudian. Rank, we remember, was a pupil of Freud, and he later on broke with his teacher. Because the Freudian elements or issues here are lingering attachments to one's parents, or lingering attachments to one's instincts, or an effort to satisfy instinctual desires in an antisocial way, any one of which can get an individual stuck at a childish level of development. Rank himself, in describing his monomyth, the structure of his monomyth, in a book called The Myth of the Birth of the Hero, describes it this way. The hero is the child of most distinguished parents, usually the son of a king. His origin is preceded by difficulties such as continence or prolonged barrenness or secret intercourse of the parents due to external prohibitions or obstacles. During or before the pregnancy, there is a prophecy in the form of a dream or oracle cautioning against his birth and usually threatening danger to the father or his representative. As a rule, he is surrendered to the water in a box. He is then saved by animals or by lowly people, shepherds, and is suckled by a female animal or by an humble woman. After he has grown up, he finds his distinguished parents in a highly versatile fashion. He takes revenge of his father on the one hand and is acknowledged on the other. Finally, he achieves rank and honors. The underlying cause for the hatred of the father, which is what gets expressed in the myth as far as Rank is concerned, is frustration. The father has refused to surrender his wife, who is the real object of the son's affections. That truth is too horrid to face directly, so it gets shielded by concocting a story about a hero who isn't a culprit but is an innocent victim. And the incestuous desire for the mother is therefore always masked as a drive for power. When we make up these stories, we always do so in the third person, says Rank, so they're always about somebody else. But by identifying with the hero, the myth maker vicariously enjoys the hero's triumph, which is in fact his own. The self is thus always the real hero of the myth for Rank, and the heroic story usually ends with the attainment of a throne and frequently the attainment of a mate. Robert Siegel, in the entry called Heroes in the Encyclopedia of Religion, says that for Rank, the motivation for making myths is intensely Freudian. Parricide and incest are at the root of the impulse to make myths in the first place. And those two, parricide and incest, are the most antisocial impulses we have, the ones that need the most disguising. Myths still give their heroes victory over the father and winning the hand of the mother in some symbolic way, which shows how deeply embedded in the family romance myth really is for Rank. Myths are, of course, invented by grown-ups, not by children, but still, every myth for Rank expresses the wishes of a child 3 to 5 years old, at heart, the desire to kill one's father to gain access to one's mother. So for Rank, the primary motivation for myths is that the child isn't strong enough to overpower the father, but he can imagine himself able to do so. And thus, the myths will always express fixated childhood goals. Joseph Campbell was far more Jungian than Freudian, so his monomyth is not about the first half of life, but about the second half of life. Where Freud and Rank found the origins of heroism in relation to one's parents and instincts, Campbell, following Jung, finds it in the relation to the unconscious. For Jung, the goal of the first half of life is to forge consciousness. The goal of the second half of life is to connect with the unconscious. That is, we spend the first half of our life finding our place in the external world, and then we spend the second half making contact with our own unconscious. Robert Siegel, again, talking about this aspect of Jung's thought, says one must return to the unconscious, from which one has invariably become severed. But the ultimate aim is to return in turn to the external world. The ideal is a balance between consciousness of the external world and consciousness of the unconscious. So the goal of the second half of life isn't really to undo the achievements of the first half, but to supplement them. For Freud, neurosis is the failure to establish oneself in the external world of work and love, and that's of course reflected in Rank's monomyth. For Jung, neurosis is a failure to establish a proper relationship with the inner world, with one's own unconscious. So for Freud, the problems are the result of an excessive attachment to the world of childhood. For Jung, they are the result of an excessive attachment to the external world one enters upon breaking free of childhood. So, where Rank's monomyth begins with a child's birth, Campbell's begins when the adult is called to some adventure. When the call comes, the hero has to be ready to leave behind home and everything that has been accomplished in the outer world and to confront the unconscious from which he is separated. When he ventures into a strange new world he didn't even know existed, the hero meets a goddess whom he may marry, and he clashes with a male and defeats him. In the process, he becomes one with both, and he becomes therefore divine himself. But in all of these adventures, as we've mentioned before, the hero is in fact venturing into his own unconscious. For Jung, and hence for Campbell, parents, for example, always symbolize the gods, who in turn symbolize the father and mother archetypes, who are in fact components of the hero's own personality. So when the hero meets these figures, the whole adventure is internal. It is his ego meeting his unconscious. For Jung, the archetypes in the unconscious aren't there because they've been repressed, as is the case with Freud, but because they've never been conscious. And so the quest of the hero is to get in contact with parts of his personality he's never had a chance to know and have never had a chance at realization. So no matter where the hero goes on an adventure, all of the events take place in his own mind, where the hero confronts the unknown parts of his own psyche. Campbell himself says in The Hero with the Thousand Faces that the first job of the hero is to retreat from that world of secondary effects, the everyday world that we've learned to live in order to get to this new world. As he says it, the first work of the hero is to retreat from the world of secondary effects to those causal zones of the psyche where the difficulties really reside, and there to clarify the difficulties, eradicate them in his own case, that is, give battle to the nursery demons of his local culture, and break through to the undistorted, direct experience and assimilation of what C.G. Jung has called the archetypal images. Part of the great pattern for Campbell of the adventure itself, of the heroic quest, is simply a magnification of the formula of all rites of passage, or all initiation ceremonies, which includes the steps of separation, initiation, and then return. As he says, a hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons upon his fellow man. So that there is a separation, and then there is initiation, and then there is the return. One of his examples that he uses at this point is that of Jason, whom we looked at in the last lecture, who sails through the clashing rocks into a sea of marvels, gets around the dragon that guards the golden fleece, and then returns with the power to take the throne away from a usurper. The adventure for Campbell always begins with a call from the other world. This is the world of the hero's own unconscious. He illustrates this with the Grimm brothers story, The Frog Prince, which begins when the princess's golden ball falls into a well from which emerges a loathly frog. The frog is, of course, a herald from the unconscious deep. It may look disgusting, the frog may look disgusting to the princess's conscious mind, but her unconscious mind will recognize that frog and may even find him fascinating. Once the hero has decided to heed the call, to pay attention to it, to listen to it, there is no going back, because ordinary life after this is going to look flat and dull and empty of value. If at this point the hero decides to ignore the call, once he has answered this far, it cannot be done. Signs and heralds will occur with increasing frequency and have to be answered. Because by this time, according to Campbell, the center of gravity has shifted from the familiar scene of social and external world to some unknown region which is full of danger and treasure, a kingdom which may be below or above the sky, a secret island, it may be below the water, and then the adventure is underway. Before the hero accepts this call, he can always turn away. He can refuse the call. He can recommit himself to the external world that's familiar and comfortable to him. Some who refuse that call will stay asleep forever. But once that call is heeded, once it's accepted, then the hero frequently encounters a supernatural protective figure. It may be an old woman, it may be a wizard, it may be a hermit, it may be a shepherd, a smith, even in fairy tales, a fairy godmother. Virgil is a figure like that for Dante in the Divine Comedy. Merlin and the Lady of the Lake are figures like that for Arthur. Gandalf for Frodo in The Lord of the Rings. These figures, these supernatural figures, for Campbell are always generated from within. They reassure the hero that all the forces of the unconscious are on his side in the coming adventure. Sometimes this supernatural figure provides amulets or weapons or charms so that the hero can be reassured about the dangers ahead, as Arthur is when he receives Excalibur, or Medea gives Jason the ointment that makes him invulnerable, or Shamash stations guards at dangerous places that Gilgamesh has to cross. The next step for Campbell is crossing that first threshold, and this is moving from one world to the next. And that threshold is usually guarded by ogres or dragons or monsters who represent the boundaries of the hero's current sphere. Beyond those boundaries are darkness and the unknown, well beyond the safe, rational world and community in which he still lives. Most people stay within those boundaries, but the hero is the one who ventures into the darkness of the unconscious, which contains both threats and delights. It contains both treasures and dangers. Sometimes the two turn out to be simply different sides of the same figure, as it is with Pan, for example, the Greek figure who lives outside the city, deep in the forest. He can still instill panic, and that's where the word comes from. Panic comes from Pan. He can still instill panic in those who venture into the territory, but he can also be gentle and helpful for those who worship him, who know how to deal with him, who deal with him properly. Those guardian figures, for Campbell, are of course projections of unconscious content. For those who are prepared for them, that is the hero who's done the right preparation, who's moving in the right direction, they can be defeated or won over. And Campbell illustrates with a story from the Indian Jataka about an early incarnation of Buddha who runs into an ogre called Sticky Hair. When the early incarnation of Buddha tries to get by Sticky Hair, he first of all looses all his arrows and they all stick to the ogre. Then he loses his club and his spear and then his hands and his feet until he is absolutely glued to this monster. But the ogre notices that Buddha's not frightened and he says, "Why aren't you frightened? Why aren't you scared? I'm about to eat you." And Buddha says, "Well, it's all right. Death is inevitable anyway, but I should warn you that I have in my stomach, in my belly, I have a thunderbolt that will kill you if you eat me." The thunderbolt, as says Campbell, is the thunderbolt of knowledge. It's the knowledge he has inside him. And the ogre recognizes this too and lets him go. In fact, it has a really sweet ending because the Buddha then teaches the ogre the way and transforms him into a woodland spirit who is capable of achieving offerings. Campbell sums up this whole episode with Sticky Hair in the following way. As a symbol of the world to which the five senses glue us and which cannot be pressed aside by the actions of the physical organs, Sticky Hair was subdued only when the future Buddha, no longer protected by the five weapons of his momentary name and physical character, resorted to the unnamed invisible sixth, the divine thunderbolt of the knowledge of the transcendent principle, which is beyond the phenomenal realm of names and forms. Okay, so the hero, another way of saying this, that the hero is simply at this point released from his ego, which he leaves stuck to Sticky Hair, and then he passes on. Campbell's next stage is in the belly of the whale. The reference, of course, is from the book of Jonah in the Old Testament. And his point is that in some stories, the hero has to get swallowed up, has to disappear, has to die in some kind of way, the way happens to Red Riding Hood in her story. No one can rise to higher consciousness without in some way dying to the old, shedding one's ego like an old snakeskin. Osiris, remember, was actually cut up into pieces and scattered across the land and sea. But once the ego is left behind, the hero can pass in and out of the dragon's mouth as he pleases, as Heracles does when he saves Hesione by getting himself swallowed by the same monster that had swallowed her and then cutting both of them out from the inside. At this point, Campbell says, the hero has died to time and he has entered what Campbell calls the world womb, the world navel, the earthly paradise. In a kind of symbolic way, the same thing happens to us, the same pattern that he's talking about happens whenever we go into a temple. Temples are generally guarded by their own monsters, by gargoyles, by dragons, by lions, by winged bulls. But if we're prepared for the journey, we can pass right by them to the higher silence which is within the temple. But we have to leave our egos at the door to remind ourselves that we are but dust and ashes. Having entered that other realm, the adventure proper really begins. The hero may be set a dozen impossible tasks like Heracles or Jason or Gilgamesh, or like the shamans, he may have to make a perilous trip into other worlds. He may be aided by the amulets that he's been given earlier, or he may find other sources of power. He's, of course, according to Campbell, working now in the labyrinth of his own unconscious, and the figures that he meets are symbolic figures of his own. If the hero has, at this point, really divested himself of his ego, he can now see what's really there. As we remember from lecture 14, Inanna took that trip to the underworld, and at every single gate of the underworld, she was stripped of something until by the time she passes through the seventh gate, she stands naked before the goddess of the underworld. When she's there, and this is crucial for Campbell's monomyth, when she's there, she realizes that Ereshkigal, the goddess of the underworld, is not a separate entity, but is a part of herself. She's her sister, a part of herself that she wasn't aware of. And this is the ultimate lesson that the hero learns in confronting those creatures from the other world, that they really are parts of oneself. Then comes the meeting with the goddess in the other world, and this is a kind of ultimate moment in the adventure for the almost always male hero. In Jungian terms, the hero meets the anima, the feminine side of himself, and he makes contact with the deepest core of his being. Campbell says, in describing this moment, "Whatever in the world has lured, whatever has seemed promise joy, has been premonitory of her existence, in the deep of sleep, if not in the cities and forests of the world. For she is the incarnation of the promise of perfection, the soul's assurance that, at the conclusion of its exile in a world of organized inadequacies, the bliss that once was known will be known again, the comforting, the nourishing, the good mother, young and beautiful, who was known to us and even tasted in the remotest past. Time sealed her away, yet she is dwelling still, like one who sleeps in timelessness at the bottom of a timeless sea." The cosmos at this moment to the hero seems feminine. The cosmos seems the good mother, nourishing and protecting. But the hero also needs to remember that the good mother is also the death of everything. She is both womb and tomb. She is the sow that eats her farrow. She is the goddess who condemns her consort to death. If the hero has come this far, and if he really understands what he's doing at this point, he can contemplate both sides. He can free his mind from infantile memories, his own memories of his own mother, both good and bad, and he can open up his mind to all aspects of her being. Campbell tells another story of a 19th century Hindu mystic who watched a beautiful woman give birth to a child and then eat the newborn child. As he says, only heroes who come this far can actually contemplate both sides of this with equanimity. Lesser men who are working only with their conscious or rational minds will see the feminine either as an idealized vision or as a dangerous temptress or even as a demon. Only someone who has come this far can contemplate both sides of this, as did the Hindu mystic who watched this woman give birth and then eat her child. Actaeon, we remember in his myth, chances on Artemis bathing in a pool, and she turns him into a stag killed by his own hounds. Campbell says the point is that Actaeon was not psychologically ready for a vision of the goddess. He was still caught in his own infantile awarenesses with their overtones and undertones of desire, and so he was ripped to pieces by his own hounds, representing those infantile desires. The hero who's come this far in Campbell's quest is now beyond the practical, he's beyond the conscious, he's beyond the everyday attitude toward women, so that he can see the goddess now as the totality of what can be known. When seen by eyes that aren't ready for the vision, she appears either as an impossible ideal developed from nursery fantasies, or as the temptress or distraction from everyday life that she becomes in so many other myths. If, Campbell says, we can see her in all her complexity and inscrutability, then the hero may possess her sexually as a sign of his enlightened vision. Now he's on the verge of winning the final boon. When he possesses her, he assumes his father's place, not by rejecting the female part of himself, but by embracing it and thereby becoming what Campbell calls the spiritual king of the world. The next stage for Campbell is the atonement with the Father, which Campbell always insists that we pronounce at-one-ment instead of atonement, which means that the hero achieves a kind of identity with the Father. Like the mother, the Father has a double aspect. He is both judge and giver of grace. Campbell illustrates this with a Navajo story about twin sons of the sun god who travel to see their father. With the help of Spider Woman, they make the long and complicated journey and they get there. When they get there, their father puts them through an enormous and difficult series of tests. Only after which they have passed them all does he fully accept them as his sons. In a sort of way, the story of Job in the Old Testament functions in somewhat the same kind of way, God putting Job through a series of tests before finally accepting him as his son. In psychological terms, when the son outgrows the mother's breast, he moves into the world of adult action, and then he passes into the realm of the father, who is the symbol for his future roles and tasks. In the early days, it's the mother who represents the ideas of good and evil. Now the father comes to represent those, which are always complicated by competition with the father for control and power, which always happens between sons and fathers. In the myth, the father then passes on to his son the symbols of office, but only after the son has been purged of infantile responses, self-aggrandizement, personal preference, and resentment, which is why the father always puts the son through a series of tests. If he passes, the son becomes one with both father and mother, who, as we understand now, are aspects of each other, and the journey into the unconscious is nearly complete. The next two steps are, in fact, apotheosis of the hero and the ultimate boon, and then it's time for the hero to come back home. Various things can happen to the hero on his way back. He can choose not to return at all, but to remain in the realm of his vision. If he does, he will be the only beneficiary of his quest, and he will never bring the boon back to his community. If he chooses to return, and most heroes do, if he wasn't ready for the boon, if he had to sort of steal it, he will probably have to run for his life back from that second world back to the one he started out from. And he will probably be pursued by denizens or demons or some members of that unconscious world. Jason and Medea, remember, have to dismember her young brother and throw the pieces into the sea to delay the pursuing king of Colchis. In the Japanese myth of Izanagi and Izanami that we looked at back in Lecture 16, Izanagi manages to escape the underworld, but he's pursued all the way by demons back to the entrance. The hero, if the hero is ready for the return, on the other hand, he or she can be rescued on the return journey, as is Amaterasu, that we also looked at in Lecture 16. Remember that she was drawn out of the cave by a dance, by a mirror, and then a straw rope. The meaning is that the consciousness has given way to the journey. The ego has been set aside, and once that happens, the unconscious can provide its own aids in getting us back home. When the hero gets back home, he has to recross the original threshold to return to ordinary life. That may be difficult, since he returns to a world of people who haven't made the journey and who still think of themselves as complete people who don't need any help. He brings with him an ego-shattering, life-redeeming elixir which will probably be resented by people to whom it's offered, because it would disturb their lives as much as the hero's was disturbed when he answered the call in the first place. Dreams, which are the individual's myths, can look silly in the morning, and prophets can look like fools in front of people who have never been on a quest, and that frequently happens to the returning hero. Rip Van Winkle runs into this problem when he recrosses his initial threshold on the way back home, and he never convinces anyone that he has anything of use to them. All he has to show for his journey, Campbell says, are anachronisms and long whiskers. What happens to the hero on an adventure is something like what happens to the three disciples who witnessed Jesus' transfiguration. They become aware of the simultaneous existence of two different worlds. The same thing happens to Arjuna in the Mahabharata when Krishna reveals himself as Vishnu and allows Arjuna for a moment to see the entire nature of the cosmos, and he has to become aware of the existence of the simultaneous existence of these two worlds. The vision is achievable only by people who have extinguished their personal wills and egos, so that personal wills and ambitions don't matter in the face of something larger outside the self. Once that happens, you make that journey, what you've learned on the journey, part of the consciousness, bring it back, and then share it with people who haven't been on a quest, or at least haven't been on one yet. Campbell illustrates his whole monomyth with a very quick and tiny and beautiful little story. This is the Welsh myth of Gwion Bach, who journeys to a land underneath the waves where Ceridwen, who's the goddess of grain and fertility, captures him and keeps him in her place for a year, stirring a great cauldron in which she's brewing a brew of science and inspiration. The goal is that if you keep stirring this for an entire year, at the end of a year, 3 drops will be distilled, and those 3 drops will be the drops of inspiration and grace. Toward the end of the year, he's been stirring, for almost a year. Toward the end of that year, 3 drops fly out of the cauldron and land on his finger. They're hot, and so he instinctively licks his finger. When he takes those 3 drops, when he licks those 3 drops, he instinctively knows everything, because those were the 3 drops that this whole brew was designed to produce. He knows everything from now on. He also knows that Ceridwen will seek for his life for usurping the potion that she had spent so much time and effort making. So he runs away, and he's pursued by Ceridwen. He changes himself into a hare, she becomes a greyhound. He leaps into the river and becomes a fish, she becomes an otter. He becomes a bird, she becomes a hawk. Eventually he changes himself into a single grain and then drops himself into a huge pile of grain. She chases him there and keeps eating grain until she finally eats the one. She finds the grain that is Gwion Bach and eats it. 9 months later, she bears him as her son. She had meant when that son was born to kill it, but he turns out to be so beautiful she can't quite bring herself to kill him as she had wanted to. She wraps him in a leather bag and throws him into the sea. He's discovered in a fish trap and he's raised by people who call him Taliesin, the poet of the shining brow, who becomes one of the greatest of all Welsh poets and who will tell about the worlds that can be discovered on such quests. It's a perfect illustration of the monomyth. Well, that's a kind of quick overview of Ronke's and Campbell's monomyths. Now that we have a more specific model to work from, next time we're going to look at the African epic of Moindo, using both of these categories, both of these monomyths and structures, to see what we can find out about that epic from these monomyths. That's next time.